En un mundo de cambios constantes y acelerados, la represión y la violencia amenazan nuestros espacios día a día. Para enfrentar estos desafíos desde la acción no violenta, es fundamental contar con herramientas que nos permitan analizar, describir y sobre todo actuar desde nuestras propias realidades. Esto es Videopodcast, un espacio para la difusión y visibilización de acciones no violentas, impulsado por el Instituto Regional para el Estudio y la Práctica de la Acción No Violenta Estratégica en las Américas y Flaxo, Ecuador.
So, hi everybody, I'm Priyanka Peñafiel. I'm part of the Regional Institute for the Study and Practice of Strategic Nonviolent Resistance in the America. Welcome to our podcast, Stories of the Nonviolent Resistance. Today, we are so happy to have Isabel Branson, who has done research on peace, diplomacy, and conflict theories, nonviolent resistance, as well as on women, peace, and security. She has studied various conflicts, including Colombia, Northern Ireland, the Philippines, Tunisia, and Syria. Welcome, Isabel. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, so today we will explore more on your book. First, we want to know how can microsociology help us understand power dynamics in nonviolent resistance?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, my book, The Microsociology of Peace and Conflict, explores basically many different aspects of peace and conflict, and one of them being exactly nonviolent resistance. And one of the sort of kind of insights that's particularly useful in nonviolent resistance from microsociology is first of all to consider kind of like domination power structures of, for example, an occupying power or an authoritarian regime that you would have in nonviolent resistance. You would go up against them. These kind of structural violent structures of domination, rather than seeing them as something sort of abstract and sort of very solid, then through microsociology, you get the insights of how you can sort of challenge them, challenge all these kind of rituals of domination little by little. So imagine an authoritarian regime and think of their military power and their sort of general domination in society through all kinds of rituals of sort of oppression, repression, and domination. Let's say the military coming to the beat, meeting, all these kind of things. And then in traditional, basically nonviolent resistance studies, you consider such an authoritarian regime as sort of based on pillars of support. So you have the military as one pillar, and you have kind of education, police, different pillars of support. But with microsociology, you rather consider it as, you can maybe think of it as sort of one big musical ensemble, like a sort of a big kind of, I don't know, movement of all kinds of small interactions. And then rather than sort of the big pillars of support that has to be sort of crushed, you think rather in terms of small sort of all kinds of annoying interactions or like resistance that was sort of challenge this big musical ensemble. So suddenly someone is not sort of playing, in rhythm. Someone is kind of challenging the whole kind of I guess, how to put this, the whole kind of music, basically. So if you think of an authoritarian regime rather as a musical ensemble, then you can have sort of someone going up against the rhythm as nonviolent resistance and then challenging the whole power structure, basically. So not necessarily sort of pushing down one pillars at a time, but simply putting small kind of I don't know, small stones into the machine or something like that. That will sort of challenge the overall flow of domination.
Okay, good. What practical strategies can nonviolent movements use to reduce or confront repression?
Yeah. Well, it's obviously always very difficult. So if you are violently repressed by a regime in the streets, I mean, in many cases, there's not much you can do because you're met with violence and you really try to maybe act non-violently. But still, there are things you can do. So another insight from microsociology is that violence is in fact difficult. So if you're face to face with someone who's and you want to attack them, it's actually very difficult. If you're looking eye to eye with someone, it's extreme. You have to be really highly trained in violence for you to have the ability to actually attack. And especially if you're offered roses or, hugs or I don't know. But it really depends on the situation. So you cannot really, it's not kind of home safe that you can always, you give a rose and then you're not attacked. But still, there are many examples from, for example, the Arab uprisings in Egypt and elsewhere where you have activists actually approaching armed forces with, let's say, a kiss or a rose or something like that, and then they do not attack. But then the problem is that still people, let's say, snipers in rooftops and so on, they can still attack you because they are not sort of face to face. So I'm not saying this is in any way easy, but it's still a takeaway that nonviolent resistors can use, and importantly, also using the sort of potentiality in actually surprise. So even one thing is kind of the more rapprochement rituals that you try to approach police with, like roses or songs or, we are peaceful, what about you? Or something like that. But another option is to simply surprise them, because that's also, they're used to sort of when we attack, people will run away. That's how people do, da 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 da. But if you do something very different, that kind of shock effect, my research shows, can also be an element in resisting and sort of disrupting basically domination. So that's the core sort of focus. How can we disrupt domination? They try to dominate us in these ways, but we try to little by little sort of make that very difficult.
Indeed. Talking about emotions and rituals, what role do emotions and rituals play in nonviolent resistance?
Well, it plays many roles. One thing is to consider domination as a ritual that can then be disrupted, and through nonviolent resistance. Another important role of emotions and rituals is to think in terms of, the basic ideas of microsociology in my book, The Microsociology of Peace and Conflict, published University Press, comes from the American sociologist Randall Collins, who basically, his core idea that social interaction, where you have mutual focus of attention, where you have bodies being in the same room, and they people interacting in rhythmic manner. So I say something, you say yeah, we go back and forth. We have this kind of or it can also be that we march together or sing together in the same sort of rhythm, falling into each other's rhythm. That form, and he calls it a ritual, an interaction ritual, that produces energy inside individuals. So you're energized, you sort of, and it's not just sort of a nice feeling or something, it's actually a core ingredient for agency, for action. So for people, and this is a general theory about human beings, for people to actually to act, they need not only sort of the motivation in terms of what they want to entail, or that they are sick and tired of repression or whatever. It's actually critical that they have the energy to act. And so that energy can be produced in social interaction and also solidarity between individuals. So if you take part in, let's say, a protest or a march or some form of social ritual, that can not only energize you and give you sort of the energy to actually continue acting and continue resisting, it can also create solidarity and sort of coherence in your movement, which is again absolutely critical for making a difference in a society. So that is at least one of the sort of kind of takeaways from microsociology when it comes to emotions and rituals in nonviolent resistance.
Mhm. What are the key factors, in your opinion, that determine whether a nonviolent movement or campaign succeeds or escalates into violence?
I mean, it's obviously difficult to have sort of general thoughts about this because you can have, many reasons, but well, in my research on the Arab uprisings in Bahrain, Tunisia, and Syria, one of the things that really came forward in my research was the importance of unity amongst protesters, the degree to which they could really stick together, even if and when met with repression, and also. Indeed, the type of resistance that they were met with. So, or the type of kind of oppression that they were met with and how that affected their sort of unity. And also when they decided to escalate. So did they decide to escalate at a time of unity or at a time of disunity? In actually in Tunisia, when they said, well, now enough is enough, we really escalate now, this was at a time of really high unity, whereas in Bahrain, they decided to do so in a time of disunity. And that had really, big consequences for the movement. But then to the question of, I mean, and that is a different question, I'd say. So one thing is whether you're successful in actually toppling a regime or challenging oppression of different sorts itself. That's one question. Are you successful in that? The other question in your question here is, well, how about the risk of turning violent? Because that is a big risk in nonviolent resistance movements, because you are met with very often really severe violence, and you stand there feeling all naked with your sign or whatever in the streets. There are many good reasons for activists to feel the need to take up weapons, but actually what my research, particularly on Syria, has shown is that unlike what many researchers actually say in other cases, is that it wasn't actually kind of a strategic decision saying with nonviolent resistance leaders saying, okay, we look at this, situation and nonviolent resistance isn't successful, let's take up arms. Actually, what I found in Syria in 2011, when the first, movement started to resist the Assad regime, at the time, actually, it was not the nonviolent resistance movement leaders saying, let's take up arms. Actually, it was other people, having a practice background in military, either, criminal gangs or defectors from the military. So people who had kind of a practice experience with violence were more inclined to actually say to activists, we are not interested in standing there all sort of vulnerable in the streets with our sign and stuff. If we are joining your movement or your sort of revolution, we need to bring our arms. That's the core. That's how we do it. So more than actually, some kind of strategic decision being the ground for the shift to violence, what I've seen in my studies, it's much more kind of the importance of the practice background of people involved, and very also interestingly, the importance of material conditions. So what do we have available, both in terms of weapons or not? So in Syria, the availability of weapons was much, much higher than in Bahrain and Tunisia. And also actually in in the very situation itself. So one thing is generally, do you have access to weapons? But this is again where microsociology comes into the picture. Rather than sort of looking broadly structurally, I looked at the very situation of nonviolent resistance where protesters were met with violence. And for example, in Syria, there was one case, and one activist telling me that he organized firstly a Friday prayer in the mosque that he knew would then turn into a protest against the Assad regime at the time. And he offered at the Friday prayer, he gave participants juice bottles. And he said to me, "Oh, I really regretted that I brought juice bottles. I gave them juice bottles rather than juice put into some kind of carton, some kind of more soft material than glass." Because he knew that if faced with violent repression from the regime forces, then they would simply throw the glass bottles towards them. Whereas if they had something more soft in there, available around them, they would have acted differently. And this is a sort of, it seems like a fairly sort of banal point, but actually it does really matter what you have available in the situation as to how you will react. So if you have stones or things like that, there's a greater risk or chance that you will use them. Whereas if all you have is, I guess, roses or whatever, you will act differently. So it's not only sort of core motivation or whatever inside people, it's also really how does the situation itself shape your actions and reactions.
Okay, good. Going back on the factors or the success factors you mentioned, how to foster cohesion and unity within a movement or in a nonviolent movement, and also how to maintain nonviolent discipline, especially or particularly in times of repression.
Yeah. Well, on the first question of maintaining unity, I mean, one element is to really think through the potential sort of cleavages or lines of conflict that could arise in terms of ethnicity or religion, to really have a strategy to not make that something that can be used to sort of split the movement, because that's, the whole kind of, well, it's very often used by, let's say, authoritarian regimes or oppression forces of different sorts, occupying forces, to divide and conquer, to make sure, because they know that if they have divided a protest movement or resistance movement, then there's a greater chance of them winning. So really, it's really critical to think through, is it religion that can divide us easily, that can be sort of played as I mean, in the case of the Arab Spring, Arab uprisings, it was the sectarian card that was played, at least this is how it was put, sort of, making the sort of sectarian dimensions more clear from the regime, and making sort of pushing the right or the wrong buttons in people to make them more aware of for example, the differences in terms of sectarianism. So really here it is really critical to think as a resistance movement strategically about how to not make that sort of, for example, that can be thinking through the different also slogans that you would shout. So in Syria, for example, activists would shout Allahu Akbar, God is great, because that would really give them a lot of energy and sort of courage in the streets faced with severe violence. So it makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, it would really frighten the Christians who used to be part of the movement. Whereas there's another example, again from Syria, where actually protesters went to a Christian funeral where they decided to dress up in white and really have no slogans, no kind of fierce actions or anything like that, just simply sort of really respectful, and that there no violence erupted. It was completely peaceful. I mean, also the oppression was peaceful because the whole situation was so respectful. And And obviously, I'm not saying that's easy to do, but it really is an option to consider, exactly to sort of not have your movement being torn into different parts. And depending on the context, there can be all kinds of things that can be dividing, but really thinking through that. And then obviously, again, from the theory of microsociology, thinking through how can you sort of, and that can be very difficult when there is a, let's say, the freedom of assembly is not there. You know, if you're not free to assemble, how can you do that? But the core idea in microsociology is that you meet and you you meet physically and you engage in different rituals that will sort of not only give you solidarity but also strengthen your solidarity amongst group members. And that can be singing together, that can be all kinds of rituals depending on the tradition in that particular country. So but it can be difficult, I'm saying. I mean, many of these things, it's like depending on the context, no? Because many contexts you're not allowed to assemble, but maybe there are other ways that you can assemble, not in terms of anything like a protest or anything like that, but maybe, let's say, a party or a concert or something more kind of eatable for a regime that can sort of strengthen your movement. So really, yeah, long-term preparation. And then also finally, one insight is to think through small acts of resistance. I mean, so one of the movements that has really been a great inspiration to me is the women's movement across the world. But in my case, since I'm Danish, particularly in the Nordic countries, because here I've seen throughout the years, the past 100, 500 years, how women, little by little, I mean, we didn't start out saying, we want to have a female prime minister, we want to have, all this. All we said, we want to be able to vote. Okay, first step, we want to, so a sort of an incremental approach rather than sort of all out, let's remove the regime from one day to another, but really thinking through smaller steps. And really, again, to the extent possible, have different rituals that can build solidarity. So what the women's movement did in the 70s in my country, in Denmark, they went every summer to an island, and they said it was only for women, so no men were allowed, only women and kids, so also boys in that regard, but women and their kids. And then they would walk around almost naked to also practice new forms of subjectivity. So rather than them being sort of the sort of object of the male gaze, they would practice being subjects, being someone with agency, someone who can actually have their own sort of opinion regardless of their men or, their husbands. So, and that is not something you can simply do from one day to another. You read in a book, you think, oh God, I realize I have agency and I'm a subject, not an object. It's something you have to practice together to sort of really, again, in the long term, change your way of being in the world and build up that solidarity, because again, you cannot do it alone. You have to do it with other people. So sorry, that was a kind of a long answer to only your first part of the question in terms of this, but yeah, I hope it makes sense. But the second part of the question, what was that about again? Could you repeat, please?
Sure. How to maintain nonviolence discipline, particularly on times of repression?
Yeah, well, that is indeed very difficult, but here training is absolutely critical, because just like violence is something you have to train, and you have to train to be able to do it even when faced with people looking at you, for example, it's difficult, but so is nonviolence, in the sense that if you are then met with violence, your sort of gut reaction, your sort of without even thinking, you might feel the urge to act back, because that is really, again, that is core to the microsociological theory. where I have developed the concept of micro-sociality. So that is when we're together with other people, especially if you're physically together with other people, we sort of tend to fall into the same bodily rhythms. We tend to mirror each other. So when someone smiles at you, you really have to actually make a big effort not to smile back, not to actually also smile. And this is something you can take advantage of in nonviolent movements because, again, as I said before, if you smile, if you give roses, it's actually a challenge. You have to really put a great effort into not smiling back, into keeping a violent approach if you're met with love or some form of cordial approach. But on the other hand, if you're met with violence, it's also very difficult for you to not, so even in words, if someone tells you you're stupid, it's really, you feel the urge to tell back, well, you're stupid too, no? So you really have to train not to react. It's not something you can simply just say cognitively, like in communication, here's a flyer, you shouldn't act violent, blah, 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 blah. You believe in nonviolence. Well, all this is great, but it's much more core to our bodies, our ways of being in the world. So for that reason, training is critical. And I realize it's very difficult in many situations of let's say authoritarian regimes because you're not allowed to assemble, you're not allowed to take part in trainings or so it's it's kind of very difficult, but it is possible. And you can, you it should be possible, at least in many contexts, to do it. And I know that in the case of Egypt, that before the Arab uprisings there had been many trainings going on, actually. But also, yeah, there are different, and I'm sure your organization is also part of training different activists in that regard.
Yeah, indeed, we try to do that. So finally, we want to know what is the difference between energizing and de-energizing repression in nonviolent resistance, and what are their consequences?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, a core idea in microsociology is the concept of energy. So you can take part in energizing activities, like let's say you have a party and you're dancing and you come away feeling all kind of happy and all is good. Whereas you can also take part in de-energizing activities like a very, very boring meeting, or you feel come away. And as I mentioned, it's not just about kind of how you feel. It's really also about agency. So if you're energized, your sort of ability to make decisions in all kinds of situations and to act is really tied to this energy. You have a much higher ability to act and take decisions, make decisions if you're energized. Whereas if you're de-energized, you would be much less inclined to act, even if you're sort of equally kind of in many theories of conflict, if you have deprived needs or something like that, you would that can be core sort of reason for conflict. But adding microsociology, you would say, well, only if people have the energy to act. So the fact that my needs have been deprived, well, if I'm de-energized, I would simply sit at home and be sad about it or whatever, no? Whereas if I'm energized, I would actually have the energy to, either take up arms or go to the streets or, do something. So this energy is critical. That's what I'm saying. So, and then in sort of resistance movements, in nonviolent resistance, if they are met with violence of sort of, killing people in the streets, that is at least what I've seen, not only in the Arab uprisings, but also elsewhere. This can often, and it sounds strange, but it can actually really mobilize and energize people because, well, first of all, people get so angered about seeing people shot in the streets. And also, secondly, they would often meet for funerals, and with that sort of that being a ritual in itself, with people grieving and crying, and that can then turn into a very powerful, energizing sort of protest, the funeral itself. So the sort of that form of repression can be, in many cases, energizing, because it actually brings people together in funerals where they are actually allowed to meet, and that can turn into protest. And then there can be this whole kind of circle of violence and mobilization and violence and mobilization. Whereas in in cases where a regime or military of different sorts would attack people, but not by killing them and the killings turning into funerals and so on, but simply for example, shooting them in their eyes or in their legs, making them handicapped of different sorts, blind, or taking people to prison and torturing them there with as bad violence, as awful, so it's not that it's in any way less harmful. Except you can even die, obviously, from torture in the prison, and it can be even worse, a worse death to some extent. But then all of that is secret, no? All of the, or at least it's happening behind closed doors. So it's not something you would see directly in the streets or see through video recordings. So at least what I've seen in the Arab uprisings here, this is, I sort of frame that as de-energizing repression, and I don't want to give any kind of good ideas to any regimes anywhere. So it's not, I don't actually want this kind of insights to travel too much, but at least, what I've seen, for example, in Bahrain, in the initial part of the protest in 2011, then the regime killed people, and that turned into funerals and people being mobilized, and more people being energized to act and really, angered to go to the streets and to resist the regime. Whereas then suddenly the regime changed their tactics and instead started saying, yeah, you can protest, you can do what you want, and no worries. And then there started to be some kind of sort of, as we've been talking about already, the sort of smaller sectarian conflicts, because then now there wasn't this kind of energizing repression from the military, and then when there was more sort of fractions in the movement, then without any sort of lethal violence, the regime attacked and sort of took away the protesters from where they met at what used to be the Pearl Roundabout, sort of a roundabout in Bahrain. So what I'm saying here is here, and then since then, what the regime has been doing, and I was myself taking part in a protest in 2015 in Bahrain, where I saw how the police would attack, but not kind of kill protesters, but attack them in the eyes or in the legs, or take them to prison. And I've known, from activists that I've interviewed, that they have been torturing really hard. So, and here, rather than sort of being energized and more people taking part, what happened was more people. I've heard someone say, well, in the past 4 years of the protest taking place, I've grown 40 years older. I feel so de-energized. I feel, you could also see it in the protest that I took part in. It was not kind of this kind of really sort of energized, powerful movement that you saw from the videos in 2011. It was very kind of slow singing, slow walking, kind of really kind of much less energized, basically. And obviously much fewer people protesting still after many years, but every Friday, but really much less energized. So that is kind of the core idea of the energizing and de-energizing repression, and how. And this is then the struggle, obviously, for protesters to think through how do we not become de-energized? How can we continue to even in the absence of killings that would unite us and make us meet for funerals or whatever, actually, how can we keep this spirit alive, not only the unity, but also the energizing, the sort of energy to act even in the face of de-energizing repression.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel, for sharing with us the principal insights of your research. It has been a pleasure for us to listen to you. And also thank you all for joining us in another episode of our podcast, Stories of Nonviolent Resistance.
Esto fue Video Podcast, un programa del Instituto Regional para el Estudio y la Práctica de la Acción No Violenta Estratégica en las Américas.
Coordinación, María Belén Garrido. Edición de video y subtítulos, Flaxo Virtual. Artes gráficas, Astrid Torres.